Hello everyone. Today I'll be editing a photo that I took in Banff National Park. Actually, it was Yoho National Park near Banff. So I'm going to pull a couple files here into Photomatix. As many of you know, and you can look on my website, there's some instructions there as far as how to do HDR photography. The photos that I create are typically a composite of 3 different photos, 3 to 5 different photos. In this case, it's 3. And essentially, I pull all of these images into Photomatix, and Photomatix will blend the images together. And then I'll take what Photomatix does and I'll pull that into Photoshop and do some additional post-processing. And so today I'll work through that workflow. This is, I guess, my workflow. I'm sure there's a number of other individuals out there that will do things differently, but this is the way that has always been the easiest for me. It's the way I've taught myself. One thing when I started photography that I always found interesting was watching other people's workflows and watching the way that they did things, and so the videos really helped. And so hopefully if you're just getting into photography and you're wondering how I get the photos to look the way I do when I put them out on the website, hopefully this will help sort of work through the process that I use, and you can obviously feel free to copy it and use the same post-processing techniques for your photos. And so, all right, so what I'm going to do here, again, as I mentioned, there's 3 photos. The original exposure is this one, the 754, and then the camera also takes a dark exposure and then a light exposure. And so what the program Photomatix does is it blends all of these different exposures together. So I'm going to pull these 3 into Photomatix right now. Here on this screen, typically I will allow it to reduce the noise on the underexposed image. Occasionally, and probably in this case, I'll also allow it to reduce the chromatic aberrations, mainly just because of where the sun was and where the light was hitting. I imagine there's going to be some chromatic aberrations going on in the trees in the left-hand corner, and so I'll just have it reduce those. I've already reduced it somewhat in Lightroom, but I found they tend to go away a little bit better if you also reduce them here. So I will hit Merge to HDR and let it do its action. And here's what it pulls into Photomatix. Here's what the original output looks like when you click the method defaults. I paused the photo, I paused the recording there because it tends to take around 30-40 seconds or so to spit this image out into Photomatix. And so essentially what it's done, it's taken the best parts of the original photo, the dark photo, as well as the light photo, and it's blended them together here somewhat into what you see here on the screen. And so I usually will play around with it a little bit here when we're in Photomatix, just to do some of the original post-processing. The first 2 things I usually touch are the strength and the color saturation. Bump the strength all the way up to 100%, and then the color saturation up to around 70. Might play with those a little bit later on, but that's typically where I start with. And then once I've bumped those up, I like to play with the white point and the black point. It defaults, as you can see, to 0.25 and 0, but I usually find that you need to bump the blacks up a little bit and usually pull the whites down a little bit as well. Maybe not that much, maybe to right about there, because I want this area to still have a little bit of color to it, and we'll blend some of that. You can see that what Photomatix does, it usually makes it kind of grainy and dark, and that's not at all what the sky looked like. And so what I'll do is I'll use the sky from either the white photo or the original photo or the dark photo, and we'll blend pieces of that sky in to make the sky look nice. You can see here that either my lens or my sensor was a little bit dirty, so I'll also have to clean those spots up a little bit as well in Photoshop. So I'm just going to play around with this a little bit more to bring some of the color out into the scene. This was right before sunset, I think. I probably took this around 8:10. I think sunset that evening was 8:15. So you can see a little bit of color to the sky. Unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot of clouds above the mountain up there, which would have given it a nice color. So while I play with this here, there's a lot of tutorials out there that will tell you what each of the individual sliders does. I'm probably not the best one to give you the definitions. I just play around with them, and not every photo is not the same, so it's hard to come in here and have a set default for what the actual slider should be at. Every photo is the same. They do load some presets in here, but I very rarely use the presets. Okay, so I think that's starting to look pretty good. This is the area where I was thinking there'd be a little chromatic aberration, just given where the sun was kind of hitting, but it doesn't look like it's all that bad. So I think we're in pretty good shape. So Photomatix probably kicks some of that additional chromatic aberration out. I usually keep an eye here on the histogram. I don't want to blow out the highlights or the darks, and so you want to try to avoid these lines being too high or creeping up the side here. You want to keep it a pretty nice even exposure. So I'm going to apply this. I'm going to pause the recording here, since this will take another second or two. Okay, so now we're in Adobe Bridge, and this is where I'll pull these files into Photoshop and load them in as layers. So this is the tone map version that we just made in Photomatix, and then here's all of our originals. There again is the original, the dark, the light, and then the alternate one that I created in Lightroom that I'll use for some of the blending. So I'm just going to pull these into Photoshop and load them in as layers. And so there that goes. So here's our layers. Again, it typically puts the tone map version up on top with the original, the dark, and the light exposures all in that order. And then again, here's that the alternate one that I created in Lightroom. So again, you have alternate, you have the alternate, the original, dark exposures. And this is really where HDR kind of gets a bad name here, is where you'll see a lot of individuals just publish this photo that they took out of Photomatix, and you can see here that the colors aren't exactly right, and not just the colors, it's also just the contrast. There's not a whole lot of contrast here. And so one thing that I always found very helpful is the Trey Ratcliffe videos. He has a HDR tutorial on his website where he teaches about blending, and essentially that's merging the files together once you have the output here from Photomatix. And so it's one thing that I learned from him is just how to blend the photos. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select this masking brush tool right here, and then I'm just going to brush these files together, and again just try to blend in the best pieces from each file. So what I like in the alternate one that I created in Lightroom, I like the way the mountain looks, I like the way the trees look, and so I'm going to try to pull in some of those, and even some of this rock here too I like the look of. And so you'll see what I'm going to do is just start to paint it in. You really can't see it when it's on such a low opacity, so I'll crank the opacity up so you can see exactly what this is doing, and then I'll crank it back down. But essentially, when you have the brush on and you have a layer selected, you're just punching a hole through the top layer to the bottom layer. And so you can see that as I brush through that, the original layer that we created in Photomatix just wipes away to what's the layer underneath, which is the alternate layer that I created. We obviously don't want to go that harsh or that hard on it, because you can see that it creates this difference in the image. We want to again blend these images together nicely. So let me just crank this opacity back down around 15–20%, something in there, and just start to brush nicely over the trees and the mountain and the different elements that we wanted to bring in without creating the harsh edge that brushing this in at 100% would create. And ultimately you can get to 100% if you wanted to. And you'll see over here it starts to show a little bit of color here with the gray. If the darker this color gets, the more you're punching through that top layer. And so each time you go over it and you give it a pass, you'll punch through that top layer a little bit more. Let's just continue maybe one more time through it, bring some of this color out in the trees, get some of that sort of blurry glow off the trees. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good for the mountains so far. I do want to maybe bring a little bit of the tiny color out in this rock here. But I think everything else is looking pretty good as far as this original layer goes. Again, this was the alternative one that I created. This is the original photo. And here's the dark. So I'm gonna use this a little bit for the sky up here to darken that sky up, because it wasn't quite this bright when I was out there. So I just want to darken the sky a little bit, maybe brush this over the mountains just a tad, just so it's blended in a little bit. And I think that looks pretty good. I think I'm fine with the water the way it is. I like the color of the rocks. I like the movement of the water. I like how Photomatix blended all that together. Maybe a little bit down here. I think this might look a little bit bright. So maybe just brush out some of that brightness here so it doesn't detract away from the rest of the photo. And because really where your eye is going to go the first time you open up a photo is going to be to the lightest spot. And so I'm hoping that the eye goes right to this mountain first and just kind of works its way down into some of this other excitement here in the foreground. So I think that looks pretty good. So let's merge all these layers together here. And then I'm going to hit Control J so that I can create a copy of that layer. Because essentially, remember I said we have to pull some of these dust spots out. So with that, I'll use the healing brush. Control plus sign will zoom in on the photo and allow you to really get in here and find those dust spots. Out a little bit. Dust spot, there's a dust spot. Okay. So I think that looks pretty good. So Control J again to create another layer. And then typically the first thing I do is noise removal. So I'm using mix software here to remove some of the noise from the photo. When you when you blend the two photos together or three photos together, you typically get quite a bit of noise